All right, and with that, I will turn things over to Dr. Williams. Thank you again for being with us tonight.
Thank you so much, Russ, and thank you so much, Deb. I am really honored to be with you. And I first want to just begin by thanking FutureChurch for initiating this month-long study of subversive habits. Your support of my work and research over the years was essential, and I'm so grateful for everyone who is reading the book, sending me messages of thanks and sending me more information. It's really been overwhelming in a great way, just to have so many people engage with the work um, and share it with so many people. My talks or remarks tonight are really just to, again, provide a basic overview of chapters 6 and 7, explain why I decided to go ahead and bring the story into the 21st century. And then I'm going to stop and take as many questions as I can, because I do believe I think that conversation is useful, and you can ask me questions about chapter 6 or 7 or any part of the book. I'm happy to answer as many as questions as time allows. So chapter 6 really takes the opportunity to look at the fight to preserve Black Catholic education in the 1970s in wake of what I consider to be the radical organization of the nation's Black priests, sisters, and lay people through the formation of the Black Catholic Clergy Caucus, the National Black Sisters Conference, the Black Catholic Seminarians, and the National Office for Black Catholics. And one of the central goals of my work as a historian of Black Catholics, as a historian of US Black Catholicism, was to find ways to narrate this history from the perspective of Black Catholics themselves. And this chapter really wanted to focus on the progenitors of Black Catholic education in the United States, who were Black sisters and Black lay people, and to see how they responded to what many called an assault and a response of the successes of the civil rights and equal rights movements of the 1950s to what they considered to be a backlash that manifested most acutely in the closings or mergings of Black parishes and Black schools, and what that did to stifle the African-American Catholic community's growth, but also facilitate a mass exodus of Black Catholics from the church, those who stopped practicing or those who were in religious life who left religious life. And what I wanted to do was to tell that story in a way to help us understand what is lost when we do not center Black Catholics in their own stories. It's difficult in some of the earlier years in terms of lack of access. However, because the nation's two oldest historically Black sisterhoods, the Oblate Sisters of Providence and the Sisters of the Holy Family, have archives tracing the development of their schools, and then the fight to preserve their schools in wake of attempts to close their institutions because of desegregation. I wanted to see what that was like on the ground from the perspectives of those who we know waged significant battles to preserve those institutions, understanding their value, not only in their communities, but what they meant in terms of preserving African-American access to quality education in our nation. And so I focus primarily on institutions for whom we had significant amount of records from the archives of the Oblate Sisters of Providence. But because so many of these battles played out in the streets, there would be a lot of press coverage, and also from the records of the National Office for Black Catholics, some of which are at Notre Dame, and then others are in Florida at St. Thomas University. And what I found, I think most importantly, was an understanding and really a confirmation of one of my core theses, was that Black Catholics, if we're looking for their political mobilization, we can always look to education and the fight to secure African-American access to Catholic education and what that meant, and specifically what it meant to have Black administered Catholic schools. As I noted in chapter 1 and in chapter 2, One way that was used by proponents of white supremacy and racial segregation in the church to undermine Black leadership, lay leadership, and that of Black sisters in their own communities was to purport this insidious myth that Black Catholics did not want sisters of their own race to minister to them, particularly in schools. And certainly what we see in this chapter, chapter 6, was not only a powerful refutation of that insidious myth, but a very clear commitment on the part of Black Catholics, especially lay people, in defense of Black administered schools, especially those led by Black sisters. And so I wanted to examine the diverse ways in which African-American Catholics responded to the assault on Black Catholic education in this moment. Those who engaged in strategic accommodation to sort of the status quo within the church, as well as those who adopted the tactics of the civil rights movement and the Black Power movement to preserve what they consider to be their community's most prized possessions, and what had been and what remained to be the chief evangelization vehicles within the African-American community. And what I found was another area of rich political activism on the part of the Black Catholic community that had been overlooked. I also wanted to pay attention to and really draw specific attention to the crisis of Black vocations, and specifically of priests and sisters leaving religious life, and how that impacted the larger struggle, and what that meant, and how that has also helped to sort of curtail the African-American Catholic community's growth. Then in chapter 7, I wanted to specifically bring the story into the 21st century. And a large reason that I wanted to do that was simply because we did not have a history, just any sort of foundational history that could bring us in, that any scholar coming behind me would be able to build upon. For those of you who are familiar with Father Cyprian Davis's landmark study of the US Black Catholic community, remember that he really ends right with the formation of the Black Catholic Clergy Caucus. And then he sort of brings us into the 20th century, but there's really not any sort of foundational narrative that was there. And so that was primarily my reasoning for focusing and going ahead and doing chapter 7 and bringing us on into the 21st century. And specifically, I wanted to look at the aftermath, that there had been so much promise, so much activity in the 1970s into the 1980s, but what happens as the community begins to grapple with all of the losses, not only the losses in terms of the closings of parishes and schools or the merging of those institutions, but what happens when you begin to lose people who had been so important in the late 1960s and 1970s, and what does that mean, and how does that help us to understand the contemporary moment and where African-American Catholics find themselves in, still fighting against the closing of Black parishes and Black schools, but even more so than that, thinking about sort of the crisis of African-American vocations and what is it going to mean if in fact vocations from the African-American community dry up. I also wanted to spend some time in thinking about the transnational dimensions of African-American Catholicism. As I start with at the very beginning of the book, sort of one point that I wanted to drive home was to really underscore the African foundations of US Catholicism and of American Catholicism, to remind us that there have always been two transatlantic stories of American Catholicism, one that begins in Europe, and then another one that begins with African descended people who are living in Europe, and then those who are living in Africa and who come into the Americas as a result of the transatlantic slave trade. But I also wanted to sort of pay attention to the fact that African Americans are also doing what their secular counterparts are doing, and they are looking to decolonizing Africa for hope, but also to be a part of this building of a new world. And I knew that most people had not looked at the ways in which African-American sisters had engaged in this transnational and transatlantic sort of communication, but particularly to sort of highlight the roles of African-American sisters who went to minister in Africa and how they perceived and bore witness to decolonization, looking at their contributions to the decolonization movement, and then to sort of think about how they began to perceive themselves, not simply as a community within the United States, but to really sort of engage and to sort of think about this global Black Catholic community and how they participated. But also to really underscore the distinct differences between when African-American sisters go into Africa as opposed to their white counterparts. I then bring us in through the 20th century, paying particular attention to the efforts launched by members of the National Black Sisters Conference, specifically those who were still trying to find ways to identify and preserve vocations from the African American community into religious life. Looking also specifically at the challenges and experiences of Black women who went into religious life a little bit later, maybe in the late 70s and in the 1980s and even into the 1990s, as well as thinking about why some Black sisters, including some founding members of the National Black Sisters Conference, left religious life pretty later than some of their counterparts, leaving in the 1980s and 1990s. What was also really critical for me was to simply sort of say, also, we need to understand that Black sisters are still breaking barriers wherever they go, specifically when they begin to break into the leadership of their communities, those who become superiors of their national communities or international communities, and to really understand those feats also as very much a part of the Black freedom struggle. When I attended the 50th anniversary of the National Black Sisters Conference in New Orleans, in one particular conversation, when they were celebrating Sister Teresita Wind, when she was being introduced, a priest, an African-American priest said, you know, when she was elected to be the head of the Sisters of Notre Dame de Namur, that's when I knew that Obama had a shot at winning. That's how he understood how important that breakthrough was for her in that community. And I really wanted to, even though I don't articulate it specifically in the book, I wanted us to at least sort of understand that those kinds of breakthroughs were just as significant as what we sort of consider, you know, in terms of the election of the first African-American president. But one can't necessarily understand that without understanding the still painful and ongoing history of anti-Black racism and exclusion within the church and women's religious life. I also just wanted to sort of dot some names, just to sort of put it down for that next generation that'll be coming behind me, and also what I am myself am going to build upon. I certainly spent a significant amount of time talking about Sister Thea Bowman, and I do that obviously in large part because she is one of the 3 African-American sisters currently on the road to sainthood in our church. And Sister Thea's experience is so important because she represents that generation of Black women and girls who were able to desegregate so many white Catholic institutions, including her order, after World War II. So on the one hand, we have Mother Lange and we have Henriette DeLille, who represent that earliest generation of Black sisters and how they had to navigate and fight against all of these barriers simply to be able to enter religious life by founding communities. But Sister Thea, among everything else that she does, but in particular for me also that she represents that generation of those who were finally able to break through in white communities. And I sort of wanted to sort of also explain when we think about Thea, we can't think about her simply as an anti-racist advocate, right? That she was very clear about where she stood on all forms of discrimination, including sexism, and to also continue to recognize that misogyny and misogynoir, that specific anti-Black sexism has always sort of affected Black women and shaped their own protest strategies. I ended the book where I began it, with Sister Mary Antona Ebo and with Dr. Patricia Gray. Sister Mary Antona's story frames the project, and I wanted to end with her. And I thought it was important to acknowledge and to point out that despite all of what she's done, outside of those 3 African-American sisters on the road to sainthood, she may be, in fact, the most famous after them because of her participation in the Summer voting rights marches of 1965. What's significant, though, is that despite all of this information about her, even in her obituaries, what struck me most was that people still could not describe her accurately. That we are still unable to talk about Black sisters' stories and their journeys within the church, honestly, because we still have not been truly honest about the kinds of barriers that they have faced. And so even describing her as a reluctant convert to the civil rights movement in itself, in my opinion, did a disservice to her, when in fact we knew that she had desegregated her order, had become who we believe to be the first Black sister to lead a hospital. And so I was really struck by the inability and perhaps unwillingness for those who were trying to tell her story at her death, their inability to still deal with this sin of racism within women's religious life and within the church as a whole. Indeed, how can you say, yes, she was one of the first 3 African-American members of her community? What is more appropriate is to say that she desegregated that community, but to say desegregate means to acknowledge that history of exclusion that far too many people are unaware of, and far too many people want hidden within our understanding of our church. And so I wanted to bring that story in, and not just sort of simply thinking about her story, but the ways in which we still don't know and still don't understand in all of their entirety African-American sister stories. But also thinking about the possibilities of what that could mean. What's going forward now? We can't ignore the history anymore. Certainly with the sainthood causes, you can't tell those stories without acknowledging this history. And yet we're still sort of fumbling the bag, if you will, in terms of how we narrate this story to really understand and to really just draw home, make it clear that it matters who tells Black sister stories. And if we are not telling their stories within the context of their overcoming barriers within the church, with their confrontations with the sin of white supremacy and exclusion, then we're not going to get the story right. And it does a disservice to us, but it is also part and parcel of the history and the political project of anti-Blackness and white supremacy that we have to deal with. I chose to conclude with the story of Sister M. Martin de Porres Gray and her reconciliation with the Sisters of St. Joseph of Baden, in part because I wanted to leave on a hopeful note. Covering all of this history, particularly for those who may not be aware of this history, I recognized that a lot of people were going to feel differently about the history that I had documented. But because I remain hopeful, even as I struggle, I remain hopeful because I do believe in the power of historical truth-telling, and I believe in the power of Black sisters' historical truth-telling, especially as the church and certain segments, even if they're very small segments of the church, begin to march forward towards reparation for slavery and segregation and these histories of white supremacy. And so I wanted to leave on a hopeful note, but also to demonstrate the possibility of Black sisters' historical truth-telling. What can this lead us to? What can reparation look like for us in the 21st century, in the age of Black Lives Matter, but also at a moment where if we don't deal with this sin of white supremacy, if we don't deal with it directly and seriously, it is going to threaten us all. And so I ended with that story with the Sisters of St. Joseph of Baden and their desire to repent for excluding Dr. Patricia Gray from admission on the basis of race, but also to give us sort of the possibilities of what Black historical truth-telling and sisters' historical truth-telling could mean for us in the church. And certainly for those of you who are aware, I mean, we're already we've seen another sort of step forward. Many of you may know that the Adrian Dominican Sisters endowed a $500,000 scholarship in the name of Sister Jamie Phelps at Xavier University in their Institute for Black Catholic Studies, Xavier of Louisiana, which is the nation's only surviving historically Black Catholic university. You know, I don't know if I should say this, but you know, their project is actually bigger than that. They're also, according to the order, also going to give $500,000 to Michigan State. So it's $1 million give as opposed to 500,000. And for me, having met with the Adrian Dominican Sisters, they were one of the communities that invited me to do a presentation. And as I believe, because I know reparations are essential, but also possible, what I encourage every community to do is to learn their own story. And the Adrians, you know, took it and ran with it and have done some really, really important work in sort of reckoning with their own histories of racism and white supremacy. And I hope that other communities will do the same in the same way that the Sisters of St. Joseph of Baden wanted to reckon with what they had done, not only to African-American sisters, but potentially to other sisters of color. And I do believe that that is an important step for every person to stake. Any person who has a history wrapped up in this very painful history and legacy of white supremacy in our church. And so ultimately, what I hope Subversive Habits will do will begin a new starting point. We don't get anywhere without telling the truth. We can actually not be a loving church if we tell lies. And we have to recognize that, as I always say, one of the greatest weapons of white supremacy, it's perhaps its most dangerous weapon, is not the violence, but its ability to erase the history of its violence and its victims. And so when we tell the stories of people who have been intentionally erased, I do think that we get to an opportunity, or at least put ourselves in a position to be able to enact reparative and transformative justice. And I hope that Subversive Habits is just one part of this ongoing effort to get the church to make reparation for what is an egregious sin history of white supremacy. So I'm going to stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Williams. We really, there, can you hear me? Thank you, Dr. Williams. We appreciate your being with us tonight and just this tremendous work. It's life-changing for the church, and we're very appreciative. So what we're going to do is we're going to allow you to ask questions, make comments. So if you'll just use our normal system of using that little reaction button with the hand, if you hold up your hand, sometimes I've missed it. So if you can just do that, use your reaction button, I would very much appreciate it. And we will carry on here. This is your chance. Okay, we've got Martha Coe. Martha, go ahead.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you, Dr. Williams, so much for your presentation and for your amazing historical research. I was just stunned. I was a history major, and your amount of sources and the digging that you've done is just, it's just totally amazing. And I want to thank you for that. And I thank you for opening my eyes. As a lifelong Catholic, I can honestly understand that I had no clue, no understanding, really no information, no truth telling, nothing about Black Catholic sisters and the pain and the rejection that they went through from their very beginning, from their very day. And that pain just comes through in your book. It makes you cry. And I'm so glad that somewhere along the line, I found out about holy perseverance, because I kept saying to myself, why do they keep going? I don't know. I mean, how much rejection can one person take before they just give up? And then I heard holy perseverance. And that's when I knew that it had to be God that was bringing these women day after day, painful racism, comments, just everything. And I have been so pleased with my church, Holy Name of Jesus Cathedral in Raleigh, North Carolina, when the social justice, social racial justice movement, for bringing me in contact with this history and the church history that has to be known and be told. And if there's any time in our country we need this truth telling, because we are facing a backlash of white supremacy through which we really may not recover. And that scares me. I'm going into the sunset years of my life, and I would just cry if all the work of teachers and religious and our church, doesn't survive. So thank you for your amazing effort. And I'll be quiet because I know there are lots of people who would like to talk. Thank you, Doctor.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the sharing. It really means a lot. Thank you.
Daryl, you have a question.
Yes, thank you. And Dr. Williams, thank you for your book. This is the best thing I've read in a long time.
Oh, good.
I mean, and if your hope was to have inspiration, that's what you did with the truth telling. So I've been a been a Catholic convert for like 23 years. And I will say it has been difficult and a drag many times. So your book was really hopeful, and I wanted to thank you for it. The one question I had, the thing that really I was struck by was when even the sisters who left their orders, when they left, many of them, if they were still in good health, they continued their struggle somewhere else. And to me, it just showed the imprint of a Catholic conscience about social justice and change that carries beyond the order into the lives of the people. And I was just impressed at how many different areas, whether it was the president of Bowie State or wherever, how many different areas that former sisters went into, or current sisters. If you could talk a little bit about that legacy they carried on.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that question. One of the things that bothered me was that I had to cut so much out of my book because I wanted to, in every footnote, for those who left, sort of say what they did, because there's so many more stories that are there. It's just, I probably went over like 15,000 words, and like my press and I were going back and forth. I was like, let me get it back in. I would sneak stuff back in, but that was just something that I couldn't get in. I also want to sort of, in addition to, in religion, her name was Sister Mary Marcelina Brooks. Her secular name was Shirley Marie. But when she left religious life, she took the name, she kept Marcelina and just took Marie, and became not only the first woman president of Bowie State, but also she was later like a vice president of student affairs at the University of the District of Columbia. So many of these women who had master's degrees and doctorate degrees went on to have really, really phenomenal careers in the academy or as principals. And who were these amazing sisters who were very much a part of this cutting edge transformation facilitated by the National Black Sisters Conference. Another sister that I wanted to draw your attention to, Sister Elfrida Chapman, who left religious life. She was the first Black Humility of Mary in Ohio, who later went on to become this pioneer scholar in information studies, earned her Ph.D. I think she got her Ph.D. from Berkeley, and then had an amazing career in information studies, really helping us to sort of think about how we include those at the margins. There are actually so many wards named after her. I think there's a big one at the University of North Carolina in their School for Information Studies named after her. And yet they didn't know she was a nun, right? So many of these women, when they leave religious life, I know there are some communities where you're expected never to talk about your time in religious life, and some women who simply didn't, that they put that behind them. But there's so many women like her who left religious life and become these very pioneering scholars, Black women scholars in their field. Another former sister that I want to mention is Dr. Teresa Perry, who is the author of Young, Gifted, and Black, which is one of these classic texts in sort of education studies and sort of how to facilitate African-American achievement in schools. She was a Holy Family sister. She wasn't a founding member of the National Black Sisters Conference. She comes the second year, but was very much a part of working with sort of the leaders of the National Black Sisters Conference when she was in religious life. Many people may know her because her daughter is really famous, Dr. Imani Perry, who's at Princeton University. Teresa Perry is her mother. So other women like that. I'm actually working on an article right now where I actually want to lay out all those women whose stories that I didn't get to tell. There's also something else that I didn't get to there's a point at the end of chapter 2 where Sister Mary of Good Counsel Baptiste is talking about describing her order as her members as conservative radicals, and she's not married, she's not mother at the time, she's just a sister. But there are a lot of Black sisters who also have relatives who are victims of lynching. I talk about Mother Theodore and her cousin who was lynched. I know of at least one oblate whose father, who was this pioneering Black professor in Ohio, who was lynched. And that is what drove the family into poverty, and it forced her mother to put the kids in an orphanage, and they ended up in a Catholic orphanage, which is why they converted to Catholicism. But I say this all to say that there are so many people who have those kinds of connections. to political activists, you know, their siblings became nuns, like so many people that we just simply don't know because we haven't paid any attention or enough attention to the members of the Black orders, and of course, those who desegregate white communities. So as I say in the book, this book doesn't say all there is to say about African-American sisters' journey. And let me just say here, I haven't even hit the tip of the iceberg yet in terms of the stories and the richness of the oral histories that I collected, because I couldn't do everything with this book. But the next project is one to bring the oral histories together and then tell some more of these really important stories that we should all know, right? But only small segments of people know. And quite frankly, people are passing away and we need to collect them now. Thank you for that question.
Thanks, Daryl. Joanne Stevens, you have a question?
Yes, thank you so very much. I want to thank you, Dr. Williams, for this absolutely wonderful book. I have a question from some comments on page 205. And one of them, relates to the number of the decline of schools. And I'm not sure about that first figure, if there is a number that was added or a comma that was misplaced. It went from 13,1396 to 11,352 is the second paragraph. Do you see it?
Oh goodness, though there looks, oh, you know what? That's a catch. So I need to take a look at that because we didn't catch that in there. So my sense is it's probably 131,396 as opposed to
13,000.
Right, as opposed
which
to
is a
13,000.
huge drop.
Right. But let me double check that. Let me see if I have that in the footnote. And if not, I can sort of check that. But no, I didn't catch that at all. But there is sort of a profound decline to go from that many. But I need to double check to sort of see what that actually is. No, I didn't catch that at all.
Well, my question, my question about that, because I think either one is either going to be a great number or a huge number.
Right. It may be 13,000.
Right. And you talk about, how it was found that a number of the African-American students were paying more for their education than white students, which in a sense implies that with those schools receiving that money, that they were subsidizing the education of white students as well too. So my question is that would that kind of decline in terms of Black students in the Catholic school system? It almost goes back to the Hezekiah Walker song that introduced the section tonight, that this would be a suffering to all Catholic schools because there was a need that mutual inclusion for survival, in a sense, in terms of, the willingness of those parents to pay, Black parents to pay for their kids' education. So I was wondering about that and that number. And the second part about that, for the time that this figure was in the early parts of the civil rights movement, if there was any sense of how Catholic education developed Black leaders during that era and for the future, and with the decline of the schools, what has happened in terms of Black leadership, in terms of Black role models of nuns and Black students in Catholic education, that is impacting society today because the quality education wasn't there.
So first, thank you so much for both of those questions. The first one, sort of thinking about what is also driving, what are the factors driving the decline of Catholic education and the closings of Catholic schools? And it's diverse, right? You have large numbers of religious sisters who are leaving religious life, who very much are in many ways sort of these living endowments of churches, right? The living blood of Catholic schools, because so many of them are being, their salaries don't even compare to what the church would have had to pay lay salaries. And then we know oftentimes the salaries of lay teachers don't even compare to what those who are working in the public educational system in terms of benefits, et cetera. So part of that is being driven by the declining numbers of religious teaching in schools. Also efforts on various state levels to stop federal aid to parochial schools that was being used to subsidize particular particular institutions. There is also the point where they said that the church really, many historians also make the point to say that the church really grew too fast, that it did not ever really sort of have the kinds of financial infrastructure in certain communities to ever sustain itself. And so it was an inevitable outcome of just overbuilding and not necessarily planning financially, et cetera. On top of the fact that when we're talking about the ways in which the church and bishops had funded their white Catholic schools or non-Black schools as opposed to their Black schools, then we're getting into a host of other issues. And so it's really complex. What was significant though about me, specifically that figure where the National Office for Black Catholics found that oftentimes Black Catholics were paying more than their white counterparts, really spoke to the inequities in terms of the ways in which that federal money was being distributed to Catholic schools, but also the ways in which the church's fundraising and its own funds were being unequally distributed to its own institutions, forcing Black parents to sometimes pay more than their white counterparts. But even then, even those who were paying at certain points more than their white counterparts, many of those schools that were being subsidized began to be closed once the church can no longer sort of to sort of keep them open and keep the tuition low for their white counterparts. So I will always say, it depends on the region, the diocese or the archdiocese. It depends on who's in charge, and it depends on the history and how that money was being distributed in the first place and how the money was being collected to be able to fund those institutions. So it really depends on the situation. In terms of Black Catholic schools and their history and legacy of training and producing community leaders, that is very much a part of not only sort of their history as Black Catholic schools, but fits within that larger story of Black Catholic education and what Black schools were meant to do, and what their teachers, those who were in the secular realm or those who were in the religious realm, were forced to do, understanding that their schools always had another goal, if you will, depending on the institution. And certainly when we're talking about Catholic institutions and the ways in which these institutions are not only sort of providing a service and a need and serving as evangelization vehicles within the African-American community, but also understanding that these schools were very much a part of this larger struggle for Black freedom. That again, that the struggle for quality education was a cornerstone of the Black freedom struggle. And so the need for schools was in part a response to the failure of state governments to invest equitably in the development of a Black educational system, public educational system, to sort of disperse funds equally, which state governments by and large did not do, especially in the Jim Crow South, but also as an opportunity for Black Catholic parents to be able to fulfill their canonical duty and ensure that their children had access to a Catholic education. Again, we really have to understand that so many Black Catholics truly believed in the social teachings of their church that recognize the dignity and humanity of every person. And so they truly believe that the church could, through its social teachings, break down these barriers to really eradicate the color line. And they had a responsibility to do that. And one way to certainly do that was through education, by providing an education and building up a spiritual and an educational infrastructure. And so we can talk about so many graduates of Black Catholic schools, whether they were Catholic or otherwise, who attest and certainly credit their education with preparing them to be able to break down the barriers ahead of time. When we look specifically, for example, at graduates of Holy Family or Oblate schools or the Handmaid schools, those individuals, many of whom who have broken a host of barriers in, Air Force, in business, I mean, the alumni and alumni of their schools have done and broken monumental barriers in American society, and yet they have not been given credit. And that's also true for graduates of white administered Catholic schools. There is this understanding in this long history of African Americans who are not Catholic, nonetheless entrusting the church with the education of their children with a certain kind of rigor that they were going to be given, even if white Catholic schools oftentimes did not teach Black history or did not do it until the 1950s and 1960s. But absolutely what you said in terms of what is happening at this moment. And I think it really speaks to why Black superiors, the heads of the Black orders, were very uneasy about white administered desegregation. There was this fear that if you integrate Black children into institutions where they are not wanted, where you are not going to thoroughly integrate the faculty and bring in all the gifts that were given in the Black administered educational system, it wasn't going to work. And I do believe that the superiors were proven right, because now we've seen what has happened when Black children are integrated into spaces where they are not wanted. The difference now in the contemporary moment is we do not have the Black infrastructure, educational infrastructure that we had during Jim Crow. So if children are suffering in public schools or in other kinds of institutions, they don't have the alternatives that we've had in the past. And what is going to become of our kids if they cannot find safe havens? And so I do think that that was also driving, you know, the hesitancy of many of the Black superiors in wanting their sisters to get involved in some of these other battles, right? Sort of actually marching on the streets, because they are right when they're saying that we are doing freedom work in our schools. We're doing that really difficult, hard, but also really transformative work in our schools. And again, what will become of our schools if they are closed, and if our children are not welcomed into these integrated spaces? And obviously, as you said, we're seeing the impact of that. So thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Jenny, you have a question.
I do. And I think you got very close to, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, I am unmuted. I think you got close to the heart of my question in your last answer, Dr. Williams. 50 years from now, I'm hoping that we are writing another book that speaks about discrimination and segregation and isolation that women and men religious still experience in their white congregations, and consequently that children would experience in schools where Black men and women are not fully accepted and fully appreciated and fully free to teach. And I wonder in the transcriptions that you have been, that you still have, did you say 15,000 yet to go? I wonder what you're finding. You know, are you hearing that there's much that hasn't changed?
Thank you so much for that question. In terms of Black women in religious life, particularly those in white congregations, we know that in some communities, they are still experiencing the same kinds of rejection that their foremothers in the church experienced in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. I know that there was a journalist, I think he may be sort of stationed in the Vatican, but wrote a book about sort of experiences of contemporary women religious, and something that he didn't expect to find, but found everywhere, was the issue of racism. And he didn't use the names of sisters, but he noted like there was a community in Minnesota where there's an African sister who is relegated to sort of menial work in the community. Like they had her out there sort of shoveling snow and nobody else was required to shovel snow, which is not funny at all. In my own testimonies, I've interviewed African sisters who are in white congregations in the United States, as well as African American sisters. The church is still losing vocations into religious life due to racism, due to their experiences of racism. Some of it is sort of unconscious bias, and some of it is really insidious hate. You know, every so often, you know, I'm giving a talk and someone will sort of type in that there is, I'm not going to say the name of the community, but the community's in Virginia and their superior will not entertain African-American individuals coming to retreats that they do for vocations. I've heard that several times. So I do want to be very clear. Racism remains a deep sin within our church, within women's religious life, in religious life as well. It also is happening in the schools. I think certainly in wake of the global protests following the police murders of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, what we saw across the country, alumni of Black Catholic schools across the country, and then current students there were testifying to what was happening. How they teach the history of the Civil War, experiences that they had with coaches and teachers, et cetera. This is not an exception, right? These aren't blips, right? That there is something fundamentally exclusionary and racist about our church. And I mean, we can look at it very clearly. How many Catholic schools teach Black and Black Catholic history? Where is that a requirement in schools? Where are they teaching it? And then where is it a requirement? We can probably count that on one hand, well, not maybe one hand, but they are certainly not the majority of Catholic schools, whether they are administered, depending on who's ministering them. We know that they're being taught in Black administered schools, but where is it being taught? How is it being incorporated? I would say we also have to pay attention to our voting patterns. Everything sort of tells us that the majority of white Catholics are supporting, this contemporary, the administration of our former president. I listened to sisters who told me, they were like, most of our members are voting for the previous president. And, I also don't want to sort of point to him as if, he's sort of the end of it, right? Like, he's just a symptomatic of that particular party, where large numbers of Catholics, religious and lay, support that party, whose policies are one could easily, one can very convincingly argue are anti-life. And so that's just the reality. And the work has to be done. I think if anything, you ask what people say, and or at least what I've seen, I really do believe that there was a shot in the 60s and the 70s. And I think that Shawn Copeland, when she was writing in the National Catholic Reporter in 1975, called it. She says the rising American Catholic conservatism is that which destroyed the first Black sisterhood. Like, what we are seeing now is the culmination of a very coordinated effort beginning in the late 60s, early 70s in response to the civil and equal rights gains of the 50s and the 60s. So this moment that we find ourselves in was charted, and Black sisters saw it coming. Dr. Shawn Copeland laid it out, I think, very clearly. And she called for new initiations. There needed to be sort of a radical understanding of what formation and initiation needed to look like. It was not done, and I think the church is suffering. The last thing that I'll say is, more so than anything, I think there was a great lament on the part of my interviewees about what was lost, the vocations that were lost. How many vocations were lost? How many vocations were suppressed? And that is something, when we look at sort of the need for people to do the work that needs to be done in the coming decades, we don't have the numbers anymore. And part of that is because so many vocations were suppressed. And that in itself is something that the church is going to have to reckon with as well. So much talent was lost, so much opportunity because of people's commitments to white supremacy. Thank you so much for that question.
Thanks, Jenny. Anara, you have a question.
Yes, thank you. I would just like to affirm and encourage something that Dr. Williams said about learning our own histories. There are a number of religious women on this call tonight, and Dr. Williams, you spoke to my congregation in April, and one of the things you suggested was that we learn our own history. And so I've been heading up that effort for our congregation. And like you said, a lot has lost and people are getting old. But I can't tell you how exciting it has been to uncover the history. And one situation I had a group of women that were all in the same class with a woman of color. And when they first interviewed them, they told me about how wonderful she was and everything else. And then one sister said, but I remember, and when she started talking, she cried, and it just opened up a whole unbelievable experience. And the other 5 that was sitting there said, how could that have happened? And we had no clue. So I think in unearthing the history, what I'm learning in a very minimal way is that a lot of it is unconscious and we didn't know. But in reclaiming it and learning it, we now know, and now we can do something about it. So I just want to encourage people to learn their own history, and it's not in our archives. We have to interview people and talk to people, and they're getting older. And so it is urgent. So I just want us to throw that in.
Thank you so much, Sister Honora. And I really, just to underscore that too, so much is not going to be in the archives, right? You know, the oral history is so essential. And again, you know, so much was said and done, you know, there will never be an archive. There will never be a written record of it. Even in terms of the rejections, I've said this before, and I'll continue to say this again, so many Black lay women who were denied, they said, you know, I didn't even write the application. I asked my teacher. I asked the visiting vocational director. So there would be no written record of the rejection, let alone the things that happened, right? You know, some of the things that happened behind closed doors that even were in public, or to understand that sometimes hostile members in communities recognize that, and they'll say something really nice one minute, and behind closed doors when nobody is looking, they'll say the absolute opposite. Of course, no one is going to know. Sometimes it's only meant to be, you know, it's not meant to be reported. So again, just to really underscore the importance of oral histories, but also just to really remind white sisters, you know a lot, even if you don't think you know. Sometimes you're holding on to something that you have forgotten, or you don't know, and it's just, and you just need someone, you just need some time to sort of think about it. I've gotten so many stories actually from white, and names of former sisters. It was from white sisters, right? Like who knew, who remembered it. It had to come to them, right? You know, we're oftentimes also encouraged to forget.
And
that's
you know
the
what
other
else
piece.
I found bringing them together to talk.
Right, with spur people, right?
They kind of scratched each other's memories.
Absolutely, absolutely. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sister Honor. We have Emily, you have a question.
Not to be repetitive, but I am also the same congregation as Nora and Dr. Shannen, you were with us. So it is good to be in your presence again. I entered in 1958. So all of what you said about the 60s and 70s was totally unknown to me. So that was just amazing. And the fact that all the work you put into this, one of the things you mentioned is how Black sisters, after Vatican II, and we didn't have to wear habits anymore, and yet how important it was for them because they fought so hard to wear one. So that was how important communication is. And my question, I have a feeling you answered it a couple of people ago, was, you know, why would the Black sisters want to be segregated in Black schools? And I think you said that because we whites did not treat the Black children as Black children. We taught them as they were white, and we didn't do any of their history. Is that what you concur?
And certainly, right, sort of when we talk about, and I, you know, I'm always very conscious of sort of, you know, when we talk about segregation, right, you know, Black schools come about as a result of white, you know, anti-Black exclusion of white in white institutions. Black institutions don't have those exclusionary admissions policies, right? You know, we know that the Oblates and the Holy Family Sisters are teaching at least a few white children in the 19th century and are doing so, like they never have any of those policies. And so I also want to be very cognizant of the fact that Black institutions are not less than, even if they were forced to form themselves into their own entities because of segregation. But to really underscore that Black institutions stood on their own. I say this, but you know, in another project that I'm working on, I'm sort of working on bringing together all these documents. And what, like, there's one section that I want to sort of literally include is just literally letters from white priests who are begging the Black sisters to come in. Because white sisters are not doing what they're supposed to do in Black schools. There's a letter from a priest in the 1960s at St. Peter Claver in Baltimore. And he is angry because none of the students who graduated from their school qualified for any of the Catholic high schools in the Archdiocese of Baltimore. And he says, we need the Oblates because they are going to do this right. That they have perfected and they know how to bring out the best talents of Black kids where these white sisters are failing. The Black sisters get these letters all the time that they have to go take over a ministry that white sisters, because they're not listening, they're not teaching Black history, they look down on Black kids. And sometimes it is very unconscious, right? You think you know Black people, and so you are teaching to them based on your stereotypes or what you don't know about them. But to really sort of ground Black sisters as professionals, women who are experts in bringing out the best in Black children and can bring out the best in all children, that their techniques needed to be replicated in other institutions. And so it's not that they think they're trying to segregate themselves, but they have an understanding that they have a worldview that is legitimate, that is one that is inclusive of all people, but also one that instills racial pride in their Black students. And that is what made those institutions, and I'm going to say elite, when we think about what people came away. And that does not mean that Black children who were educated by white sisters did not get oftentimes some great education as well, but some communities failed, and they failed horribly. And particularly when you are not teaching Black history and instilling racial pride in children who are marginalized and vulnerable to all kinds of systemic issues, that there has to be an understanding that you have to do that extra work. But also, particularly when we're talking about Black sisters, they're also sort of saying, and you need to do this for white students too, because they are also getting a false sense of themselves. They need Black history too, because you can't teach these kids lies and not realize that they are going to do what you do. So I just wanted to say, it's not simply that they're trying to self-segregate, but they have built an educational infrastructure that produced results, certainly for Black children, but also would do it for other children, and it was viable and needed to be taken seriously too. And so there was also this concern, right, that they are still vulnerable in this society, and certainly if integration did not work out, what would happen if Black parents still needed alternatives? And that was also a very key reason why they wanted to preserve their institutions. Because why should their institutions have to close in the name of integration if their institutions were just as good and they had worked so hard for decades to build them? And not simply just as good, they were also arguing they're better. And they can make that argument.
Thank you
so much.
Thanks, Sister Emily. We've got a question from initials NS.
Hello, thank you. Thank you, Ms. Williams, for writing this very difficult book. I wonder if there are any speakers in the American Catholic Church, like bishops, any leaders that are actively speaking to this issue that we might lend an ear to. Also, what should reparation look like in an ideal church, and what can it look like now in our very broken situation? Thank you.
Thank you so much for that question. Certainly, in terms of the bishops who are being very vocal about reparations and who are not afraid to say Black Lives Matter, I mean, that's a very small number of bishops. I think Bishop Sykes is one. I think Bishop Stowe is another. And certainly speaking to the sins of racism, some of the Black bishops as well, in terms of Cardinal Gregory in DC. But in terms of thinking about reparations, I think if we're sort of looking at reparations, I think we actually sort of need to look at first, formal apologies for slavery and segregation, as well as colonization. We just saw Pope Francis go to Canada and apologize for those Native American residential schools. He has to come to the United States and apologize for that, but also for slavery and for segregation. The Catholic Church introduced African slavery in the Americas. And we have to recognize, right, because Pope Francis had also apologized in Latin America for colonization, but made a point not to apologize for slavery. And that's something, because the Jesuits are among the largest in the Atlantic world in terms of their involvement in the Atlantic slave trade and slavery. Everybody talks about Georgetown. you know, they have 1,000 in the United States outside of Maryland, outside of DC. So we have to sort of talk about this larger story. But apologies are first, but also very clearly, it has to be financial. I would love to see the church formally apologize and acknowledge and repent for the sins of slavery, segregation, colonization, wherever they participated. But also thinking about it in terms of what we're seeing some communities of women religious do in terms of establishing scholarships, institutionalizing Black history. What would it mean that if every Catholic institution, every school on every level, every seminary, every formation program, every student to be able to progress to the next level has to be able to become competent in African American history and Black Catholic history. We can look at it in terms of the fundings of scholarships, professorships, et cetera. But we also need to understand too, that if we're going to sort of solve the racial economic gap, right, the church not only has to sort of pay out in terms of scholarships and institutionalizing Black Catholic history, but it may also have to actually sort of pass some checks and support efforts to put pressure on the federal government to support reparations and to put pressure on the Vatican itself to support reparations. Also, another piece of that would be also supporting and fast tracking those African Americans who are on the road to canonization. It can look like many things. I'll just say in the National Catholic Reporter, years ago, I wrote a piece of what it can look like. And that's certainly sort of a foundational piece. But I'm at the point, and certainly I've always been at the point that the federal government and the Vatican, individual communities and orders have their own sort of reparations to pay, but there has to be pressure on the Vatican. There has to be pressure on the federal government to support all of these commissions wanting to study the legacies of slavery and segregation, and actually to sort of put a price on it. Because this was about money, this was about economic exploitation. And we have to sort of recognize then that the aftermath, that the atonement has to be in the form of substantial financial reparations. Because if anyone knows the history of the Jesuits, they know that $100 million is never enough. It's not even a dip of what they owe based on their involvement in the trade and in the institution of slavery itself. So those are just some of the things that one can look at. But thank you so much for that question.
Thank you. John, you have a question. And if you can just go as fast as you can, because we're already past the hour. And
I'm sorry.
I'm just saying, I want to say that we're good questions and good discussion, but I just want to keep it as short and succinct as possible.
Thank you so much, Dr. Williams, for your work. Fabulous. Enjoyed it. Just a great read. And thank you for your work, which is such a significant work for our church today. One of the points you make in your book is the importance of education, obviously, in the Black community. One of the movements today has been the Cristo Rey schools in the inner cities. In terms of your research, have you found anything in terms of their effectiveness and their outreach to the Black community?
I haven't done any research, let me just say that, but I have heard of the Cristo Rey schools. I've had some students who are graduates of the Cristo Rey schools. And what's really interesting is my students, and it's young men, they're like, Dr. Williams, I never heard about the Black Catholic experience when they get in my class. So it's certainly, they may be very good in terms of getting their students into college, but whether or not they're actually sort of, still teaching enough Black or Black Catholic history. And this is really anecdotal, so I don't know. I haven't done any research, but I do know that they seem to be very popular in many communities. And so they are certainly doing some things right. And let me also say, their students end up in my classes. So, if they find their way to me, then that's also a good thing, I think, who I teach. But again, let me just also say, the field of U.S. Black Catholic history remains in its infancy. That's an area that deserves research, and I hope someone will take it up, so we can see where we are now in terms of Black Catholic education in the 21st century.
Amen.
So thank you.
Thanks, John. Megan, you have a question.
I do. Hi, Dr. Williams. So nice to see you again. We're so excited to have you back virtually in Cleveland. We were so delighted to have you at John Carroll last November. And one of the things that you said then that really struck me was when you were talking about your work with the different orders' archives. And I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about your process of doing the historical research for this book that involved working with all of the archives of the various religious orders, because I thought that was really fascinating.
Thank you. Everything was really contingent upon the order. In the case of the Oblate Sisters of Providence and the Sisters of the Holy Family, they maintain their own archives, are really great sources. And I was given substantial access to those communities. In the case of the Handmaids, they at one time had an archive. No one knows where it is right now. But I was able to get the materials from Loretta Teresa Richards, who was their former superior, who had maintained her own personal archive when they left the Mother House. I do know that some of their records are with the Society of African Missions, but I was never given access to those archives. And so it was really contingent upon the community. Some communities have formal archives, some of them don't, and then there's a question of access. If a sister doesn't remain in religious life, sometimes you cannot get access to her file, or if she's still alive, you need to contact her and she will give you access so that you can access the file. It just really depends on the community. You also have to pay attention to the ways in which communities, sometimes they give you access to the general council minutes or not. I would also say in terms of communities, people will find barriers. Let me just say that communities can set their own guidelines with regard to who gets access and who doesn't. And so that is also a challenge for scholars. I was very fortunate that several communities gave me significant access. Some communities did not. And that's why also oral history mattered. Obituaries matter. Black sisters who are doing this important work sometimes end up in the newspapers, especially when they're the first Black sister, the first Negro sister. So you track it any way that you can. But those were some of the challenges, but some of the benefits and privileges that I had when I got some certain kinds of access. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Megan. So Judy, you have a question.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Williams, for your enthusiastic research. I was just touched also by your acknowledging the rise of Catholic vocations and Catholicism in Africa and other places, and maybe the decline of vocations of the Black Catholic in America. And could you speak more to what caused, or what you're seeing, the trend, how it developed?
Thank you so much for that question. I knew when I was writing this book and ending it in the 21st century, I could not ignore sort of the church's explosive growth in Africa, and what that is meaning and what that is doing for Western ministries, with African sisters going into many Western congregations, whether they're in Europe or in Africa, and what that means, because they've helped to reverse sort of the declining number of Black sisters in the United States, even if most of them now are from Africa. In terms of African American vocations, we still don't have great numbers. I do think we've certainly seen a marked decline. I think part of that is rooted in the opening up of the American workplace and the benefits and the successes of the civil rights and equal rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s. I think that's true for not just Black sisters, but also sisters who are not Black, right? Or women who may have had vocations, but who are not Black. So the increasing opportunities for women certainly may have led to a decline. I think, the realities of racism, and let me just say this very clearly, the suppression of Black vocations, African American vocations in the 50s and 60s, and really up until the Second Vatican Council, has also had an impact. One can imagine, what if all of these hundreds of Black women who we know were denied in the 50s and the 60s had been allowed to persevere in their communities? If they had persevered, how many vocations might they have mentored and nurtured? So we can't discount the impact of these anti-Black admissions policies, those that have been with us and then those that are still with us in certain ways. But I think it's a bit more complicated. I do want to say African-American women are still going into religious life. I do not think that they are the majority of Black women who are going into religious life in the United States. But I do think too, the nurturing isn't being done in the ways in which it is. And I'm just going to say one thing and I'm going to stop. But I went to undergrad, and just so happened my undergrad was not a Catholic college, it was a women's college, but there were so many of us who were Catholic on campus. None of us knew the history of Black nuns. But it's funny, we had talked about it, and then we had said, oh, well, nobody wants to be a pioneer, nobody's going to do that. And so what I also sort of want to at least sort of acknowledge is that I do think that there are young African-American women and girls who may still have vocations, but they get thrown off because there's no one there to nurture them. They don't know the history. They don't know their place within it. And that doesn't mean that that's going to solve the crisis. But what I do think is, I do think that we may be missing a lot of African-American vocations because this history is not known, and there's not even the infrastructure anymore in the ways in which it was in the 1950s and 1960s. That's not a great answer, but I think that's just sort of my initial thoughts.
Thanks so much, Judy. So Ralph, you have a question?
Hello.
Hi, and I'm listening. I'm going to go turn on the light behind me, but please go ahead. It's getting dark in my room.
Let there be light. I have two quick unrelated questions. One is, did you ever run across Sister Paul Lee in your travels? The name, she was an oblate. I think her grandfather was a slave who worked for the Jesuits, as I remember.
William Henry Lee. So her niece is Sister Cora Marie Billings.
Oh, right.
So sister, and she had a sister who was also an oblate. Her sister went to the handmaids first, and then went to the oblates and died as an oblate. So yeah, Sister Paul.
Now I recall, you did write about her in your book. She's just interesting because she was pretty tough in a good way, and I wrote. We dedicated a room at St. Francis to her. And I wrote on there underneath her picture that she taught so many of us how to be Black and Catholic at the same time. And a lot of people didn't understand that, but I think she was valuable that way. And hello, Sister Roberta from Buffalo. Good to see you. The second question I had is a little bit more involved. You know, we can just touch on it a little bit, perhaps. These sisters who went into these orders, it was very challenging, obviously. I wondered what the impact was, and if it's been documented, on their mental, physical, and emotional health. Some of these sisters died at a relatively early age. It was a lot of stress, I'm sure, to live in a community where it professed a certain faith, but operated with white supremacy. Any thoughts on that?
Yes. And thank you so much for that question, Mr. Moore. A lot of sisters in their conversations with me in our interviews, they talked about that. They had said, we've been wanting to study this because we believe that it killed them, that stress killed them. And this was, before we sort of had an understanding of macroaggressions and microaggressions and the impact of racism on people's health, right? Mental, spiritual, et cetera. I don't know of anyone who's really done the work in any sort of significant way. I think it has to be done because it came up over and over again in the testimonies, like the cost of it was too high. The cost of it was too high. And I say that for myself. Collecting these stories was not easy for me either. And the one thing that I regret not doing immediately was going to counseling when I was collecting the stories, because it was impacting me. When I say that I was carrying the weight, I was carrying the weight of stories that I can't even tell, right? Those moments when I was asked to turn the recorder off and it was like, oh my goodness, what am I about to hear? No, yeah, not that I know of, although I think a lot of people have been wanting to do it for some time. I would also say I've heard that from Black priests that, their forefathers also, there are a lot of stories, we know about some of the earliest Josephites who died, go mad because of what they experienced. And I think that's also true for those who desegregated seminaries or desegregated orders in the 20th century as well. It's just another area that we need to do work on. And I hope someone will do it. Thank you so much.
No, thank you very much. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you. Mary, Malcolm, you have a question?
Yes, I do. I hope you can hear me. Thank you, Dr. Williams, for dropping this fantastic knowledge. I just wanted to say that thanks to God, I was educated at Holy Name of Mary in Chicago by the Oblate Sisters of Providence, kindergarten through 8th. My whole family, brothers, sisters, children. So, you know, their wonderful, loving instruction was all I knew. And then after I graduated and started meeting other African Americans in Chicago, who were educated in Catholic schools, I was shocked by the number that told me horror stories of their treatments by the white sisters. And, you know, most of them told me that they left the church and that they would never come back. And that really saddens me. And when I think about all those I went to school with, that school was packed at the time. It wound up closing. But my question to you is, do you have any thoughts on how, on that situation with so many Black former students leaving because they just felt abused?
I've heard this so many times when I do talk. Someone there is, you know, that was my story. Once I got out of my Catholic school, that's why I went to an HBCU, because I had to recover. I had to recover. You know, I've heard it so often. And because I've heard it so often, it frustrates me that is not included in the dominant narratives of our understanding of the church and our understanding of Black Catholic education, white administered Catholic education. You know, recently, this is earlier in July, I'd done a talk, and one of the audience members, you know, said, you know, Dr. Williams, thank you, you just told my story. My family's history goes all the way back to Louisiana. We've been Catholic for as long as I can remember. And my grandmother got us out of Louisiana during the Great Migration. We migrated to Chicago, and her grandmother was trying to get the kids, because she had like several daughters who were, as she put it, octoroon. And so they were concerned about them being vulnerable to sexual violence in Louisiana. So her grandmother had to get them out. And they moved to Chicago. And the first thing that her grandmother tried to do was to enroll her children, all of her children, into a Catholic school, and the white priest refused. And she said, that was the day that my grandmother became an atheist. And we were not. And that is our family story. We were Catholic until they encountered that barrier, the rejection in Chicago, when they go into these spaces and they're looked at as foreigners, when their history in the church and their roots in the American Catholic Church are older than the vast majority of their white counterparts. I can't begin to tell you how many stories I've heard. I only include a few. They're coming, but you know, the undercutting of talented Black students, you know, not preparing them, even though they were scoring very high, they were sort of being directed to becoming secretaries and not being directed to go to college. Really just horrific, you know, instances of harassment and I'll just say, I've heard it. And when we begin to understand the inability of the Catholic Church to retain Black Catholics, that's certainly a major factor. And let me say this even more so, not only is the experience, but the denial of the experience, because I have to continue to sort of tell people, and especially sisters, you know, when many sisters, when they're first sort of confronted with this history of racism, their first response is, but we educated so many Black children. This was the work that we were doing. We were committed to racial justice. And I said, you have to be very careful, because you are gaslighting people if you are not being completely honest, because people's experiences are not lining up to what you are saying is happening based on their own lived experiences of being educated in your schools. And so that is, I think, the tension that we are sort of confronting, right? Here's this dominant narrative of these noble white sisters who ministered to Black children without concern for color. And then here are these children who have these lived experiences who say something completely different, or it's far more mixed than one would like to believe. And I think we're certainly going to see that with these federal investigations into Native American schools. And I think maybe that finally will give us sort of the opportunity to reckon with this history and to really sort of confront this mythology that's around so much ministry in communities of color by those who are not people of color. But thank you so much for sharing.
Yes, thank you.
So we've got two more questions, Elizabeth and Sister Roberta. So Elizabeth, you want to go ahead?
Thank you, Dr. Williams, for this book and for your wherever you went inside and in your faith to keep going in this work. I've read it, and there's several people who are I would consider very active and social justice oriented of our sisters who have tried to read it and say, "Oh, I have to put it on the shelf. I can't do it. I can't do it, and I have to come back to it later." And and it took me about 6 weeks to get, because I could feel the reaction and the whatever stirs deep, because I think the unconscious gets so stirred up in this for me as a white person. And I've never been in a situation. On my anti-racism team, when we do a white caucus, but even there, we just it can slide away so that all of a sudden you're not talking about anything that matters. It's just so overwhelming. And that might be a time or a place where I can be, but I know that's not all of it. I have to keep going. But if you had a word, or did you ever experience of that with any of the white sisters you talked to, or any other light you could shed on that experience? That I mean, this is as a white sister and white women in the United States, religious life, this is our job to do. This is not your job to do. This is ours to do, to deal with it, to face white supremacy. But people can hardly even stand to say the word. You can't call me a white supremacist. I'm not going down tackling the Capitol and all that kind of stuff. I said, that's the tip of the iceberg of what white supremacy is. But then it goes straight over. I'll say no more. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. The one thing that I would say though is, just to give you one example, and I don't know if she is still alive, but she was a Sister of St. Joseph in Los Angeles. And I met her years ago and after a talk, and she came up to me and she was almost in tears. She said, "I want to tell you the names of 3 women." And she was naming the women in her community that I needed to talk to. She said, "You need to go talk to them." And she said, "I want to tell you the name of one other woman." And she's not in this book. She's in an article that I wrote, but it was her friend that she went to high school with in California, a woman named Vivian Burgess, who was the first African-American to earn a 4-year degree in nursing in the state of California. She said, Vivian went to high school with us, and when we all applied to our congregation, she was the only one that was rejected, and she was rejected because she was Black. And, Vivian Burgess went on to have an illustrious career. She sort of was a developer of independent nursing homes. She's won the highest award that a layperson can have in the Archdiocese of Los Angeles. And she's an associate member of that community. And she said, after all these years, we've never apologized to her. We've never done it. And there was such guilt on her. She was just, I don't know why we haven't done it. But I also say, just for white sisters, you're carrying this history, whether you know it or not. The weight is on you, whether you know it or not, whether you knew the history or not. You're a part of it. It's carrying you. You may not even understand the weight on you. But I do know that for Sister Patricia to tell me that, it was, she just said, please go talk to them. She didn't want to dictate the story or anything, but she said something else that stands out to me. She said it hurt because Vivian was probably the best of us, and she was not accepted simply because she was Black, and we didn't do anything. And so we also have to sort of think about, again, reminding ourselves that white supremacy just doesn't hurt people of color. It hurts everyone. It threatens to destroy everything. And so when we think about these declines and what we are facing, to understand that white supremacy is also at the root of this. Until we confront it, it's going to fall. And so it's painful. It's painful for those who have lived it and continue to live it. And the reality is we all have a responsibility to share in the burden. It's not just simply Black sisters' history. It is all of our histories. So thank you so much, sister.
Thank you. Okay, Sister Roberta, take us out with the last question here.
Oh, I wish I can. I guess I would say to Dr. Williams, I was sitting here thinking that I am so proud of you, because I was at one of those first meetings when you came to the National Black Sisters Conference, and you shared with us your vision. And along the way, we have seen that vision come to birth. So I sometimes think we are your grandmothers, you know, we kept walking with you along the journey. And I personally want to say thank you for that. But in the book and some comments you made tonight, one of the first ones I heard you say something about, or it might have been a comment I heard about the book, to say that Black sisters are in many ways the forgotten prophets. And I think that speaks volumes to me personally. And then when you said you wanted to end on a hopeful note, and I certainly, this note resonates with me, the power of historical truth-telling. And I just think of so many of the people you named that I have personally known. Sister Thea, who was part of us in the Black Conference, we walked with her, we talked with her. Another good mentor there, Pat Haley, and Tona Ebo, and then with the Selma marching, Barbara Moore. And I can just go on and naming all those great women. So I often think of this whole thing we talk about Sankofa, you know, and the book for me personally is like a Sankofa moment. We look back, but we look forward. And you have opened our eyes to take off those blinders, that we can be committed to working for healing the sin of racism and the wounds of racism. After I have been a sister in my congregation for 56 years, very proud of that. And when I listened to Sean Copeland a lot and Josita Colbert, they were two of the first people who mentored me back in Washington, DC, when on the eve of the finding of the Black Sisters Conference, 1968. And when we were bold enough to step out in faith, take risks, it could have meant that your congregations would send you home, but people were willing to step out in faith for what they believed. And just a final note, I know you spoke about what led you to write this book, but I was always curious in your title, Subversive, the word subversive habits. Could you speak a little bit about that word and why you chose that word as part of your title?
Thank you so much, Sister Roberta. Thank you so much for sharing your journey with me. Thank you for everything that you have done to support me and the work of the National Black Sisters Conference and all that you did and the conference did to support me. Subversive habits came actually from the National Black Sisters Conference. I pulled it directly from chapter 6, the quote from the practicability study from the early 1970s, in which, you know, it began, education and religion are the first two subversive forces that an oppressed people can use to liberate themselves. Religion is the guts of all human life. It can be used to silence a people or deliver a nation. And I knew that I wanted habits in the title, and I knew that it would be a double entendre. And I figured subversive was the best way to describe the sisters, not only your subversive habits and sort of forcing your church to be truly Catholic and fighting for your nation to be truly democratic, but also because you were subversive. You were pushing back against white supremacy. You were pushing back against the idea that Black women did not have the virtue or the means to become women religious. And so I thought it was an apt title, and I wanted to sort of rely on the testimonies and the brilliance and the intellectual genius of Black sisters to guide me. And so that's where the title came from.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all so much. Russ, do you want to step in here and take us on?
I certainly can do. I'm a little overwhelmed by that moment, Sister Roberta and Dr. Williams. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Williams, for being with us tonight and for staying on so long to answer all those really fine questions and to answer them so deeply with all of your historical perspective, but also the current situation, and as we look forward to the future that we can build together. So history at its finest. Thank you. At this point, we'd like to just take a few moments as we close this time together, these last 4 weeks, for you to end on a note of hope. And so I'd like for everyone who feels willing to share in our chat something that's giving you hope. Perhaps it is a lesson that you've learned, a change that you can sense happening within yourself, or maybe a commitment that you're able to make tonight. What is giving you hope?